Bonjour, je m'appelle Jean-Marc Fontan, professeur-chercheur à l'Université du Québec à Montréal. Je co-dirige avec Peter Elson de l'Université Victoria le réseau pan-canadien de recherche partenariale sur la philanthropie, mieux connu sous le nom de Philab. Avant de commencer, je tiens à souligner que les terres sur lesquelles je suis présentement situé font partie du territoire traditionnel non cédé des Kamenkeaka, lequel territoire a longtemps servi de lieu de rassemblement et d'échange entre différentes nations. Maintenant, c'est avec un très grand plaisir que Peter et moi ouvrons la première session du colloque Réimaginer la philanthropie. Avant de laisser la place à la cérémonie de reconnaissance territoriale, puis au premier panel de discussion qui sera animé par Chris Archie, je tiens à dire quelques mots sur notre réseau partenarial de recherche. Ce dernier a été mis sur pied en 2013 à la suite de l'obtention d'un premier financement du Conseil de recherche en sciences humaines du Canada. Financement qui fut complété par des ressources financières de partenaires de notre écosystème philanthropique. Notre réseau de recherche, maintenant composé d'une vingtaine de partenaires, d'une soixantaine de chercheurs et d'une vingtaine d'étudiants et étudiantes, est constitué de 4 centres régionaux, situés dans l'Ouest canadien, l'Ontario, le Québec, les provinces de l'Atlantique, et aussi d'une unité sectorielle pan-canadienne dédiée à la recherche philanthropique en milieu autochtone. Mentionnons que chacune des 5 unités est responsable de l'organisation d'une des 7 sessions de Réimaginer la philanthropie. Depuis l'obtention de son deuxième financement en 2018, Philab poursuit 3 grands objectifs de travail. Nos équipes partenariales le font en produisant de nouvelles connaissances ou en valorisant des savoirs existants. Le premier objectif vise à parfaire nos connaissances, tant sur l'écosystème philanthropique canadien que sur ses différentes déclinaisons sectorielles ou territoriales. Les deuxième et troisième objectifs entendent mieux comprendre le rôle et l'impact joué par des fondations philanthropiques dans leurs actions de soutien, d'accompagnement et d'influence dans les prises de décision pour générer plus de justice sociale et de justice environnementale. Si nous entendons favoriser le développement et la valorisation de savoirs philanthropiques, c'est que ces derniers sont importants pour répondre aux urgences, pour agir dans la prévention et enfin pour appuyer les efforts requis afin de paver la voie à une juste transition sociale et écologique du bien vivre ensemble. Réimaginer ne signifie pas faire table rase de certains acquis historiques, de savoirs anciens, pertinents et de pratiques actuelles exemplaires. Réimaginer signifie faciliter le passage à l'échelle, des comportements appropriés, de reconnaître le bien fondé d'anciennes pratiques ou valeurs, ou encore de faciliter le développement, la mise en œuvre et l'institutionnalisation de propositions éthiquement novatrices du bien vivre ensemble. Certains de nos comportements, certaines de nos valeurs demandent à être modifiés ou même abandonnés. D'autres bénéficieront à être mis en lumière ou encore à être pensés ou inventés. Nous avons donc pensé ce colloque à la façon d'une conversation inclusive qui entend rappeler les tensions existantes, qui vise à explorer les opportunités qui se présentent et à générer des consensus sur les grands choix à poser. Nous avons pensé ce colloque en fonction d'une écriture collective afin d'identifier les transformations possibles et requises pour faire des écosystèmes philanthropiques canadiens et québécois des acteurs à part entière de la transition sociale et écologique à réaliser. Sur ce, je donne la parole à mon collègue Peter Elson.
Merci, thank you, Jean-Marc. I'd like to acknowledge with respect and humility the Lekwungen peoples on whose unceded territory I have the privilege to work, play, and live, and the Songhees, Cossapsum, and Wasanich peoples whose historical relationship to this land and water continue to this day. Reimagining philanthropy, tensions, opportunities, priorities. As a consummate catalyzer, we are inviting philanthropy in general and foundations in particular to reimagine their space, place, and practice. Foundations have the inherent flexibility, freedom, and responsibility to contribute to society while at the same time critically examining the source of their wealth and its associated externalities. The role of foundations to address social justice and environmental issues lie at the center of PhilLab's work and this conference. Our opening today speaks to the tensions associated with philanthropy, a philanthropy that, historically, has benefited from social injustice and environmental exploitation to reward a few at the cost of many, human and non-human alike. Tomorrow morning, our Western Hub tackles social injustice and the struggle to meet community needs through the lens of giving in a post-pandemic world. Tomorrow afternoon, the Atlantic Hub turns the spotlight on an exploration of fish's food land security ecosystem. Thursday, we move to philanthropic practice with a healthy and critical look at philanthropic work and labor issues, the extent to which philanthropy both supports and thwarts progressive labor practices. Thursday afternoon, PhilLab's Indigenous Hub, led by the Circle on Philanthropy and Aboriginal Peoples in Canada, will profile the action component of the Philanthropic Declaration of Action signatories, signed following the release of the Truth and Reconciliation Report. Friday, we return to the theme of philanthropic practice with a discussion of how grant-making practices can be reimagined and subsequently increase effectiveness and impact. Our closing session on Friday will call on 4 leaders in the world of settler and Indigenous philanthropy in Canada to explore and discuss their particular vision for reimagining philanthropy and priorities for taking action. We hope that this is going to be a stimulating and thought-provoking 4 days for you, and we invite you to engage with the speakers and take time to reflect on what you see and hear means to you and your work in the philanthropic ecosystem.
Et je passerai maintenant la parole au premier panel d'ouverture du colloque. Premier panel qui porte sur les tensions et les opportunités qui se présentent pour la philanthropie. Et nous avons donc 3 personnes. Ce sera Chris Archie, qui est directrice générale du Cercle sur la philanthropie et les peuples autochtones du Canada, qui fera l'animation de ce panel. Et nous avons aussi Yonis Hassan, qui est cofondateur et directeur général de Justice Fund de Toronto, et aussi Damien Lee, qui est professeur au département de sociologie à la Ryerson University. Donc, je donne la parole maintenant à Chris.
Welcome. I can wait. Can I get some thumbs up if you can hear me? I can only see a few of you. Very lovely. The folks that I get to see are those whose voices you've already heard from. Wake na wait, Chris Archie, Rinsquest, Aquatum de Galmo from Zeskin. So honored to hear from you, Marlene, from the West Coast, and from you, Louis, in your territory, bringing forward some wisdom and teachings of the two-row wampum. I'm really thrilled to be with everyone here this morning, and especially to be moderating and participating, as I do, because I have a hard time being quiet as well, moderating a wonderful conversation with 2 fantastic humans, as Jean-Marc already said, Jonas and Damien. And so what's really lovely about this conversation was that there was an invitation to think about reimagining philanthropy. And I think it was really fantastic that PhilLab's, a fairly traditional academic national research space, would say, hey, Chris, an Indigenous woman, would you like to help us open this conversation? And who might you want to be in that conversation with? And so very delightfully, I was excited to invite and have Jonas and Damien join us. So We have a few questions prepared. The conversation will go wherever it pleases. And I'm really excited to get us started. So I know that there's a desire to talk about reimagining philanthropy, but I want to begin with some opening commentary from Damien to understand and to diagnose the existing colonial structures of philanthropy as it is. Before we get into reimagining, how do we make sure that everyone listening is on the same playing field to understand what we're about to talk about?
For sure. So I can say some words. I can't really see everybody, so if I'm speaking and nobody, sorry, if you can't hear me, someone's got to reach out to me. So thank you for that, Chris, and thank you for the introduction, everybody, and thank you for the welcoming as well. This is a good day to get together. I'm speaking with you today from my home, which is Fort William First Nation in Northern Ontario, and I'm here doing some work with maple syrup. This is our season, so I've been here with my family for about almost a month now. And it's a sunny day, but it's lots of snow. We just got 3 inches of snow yesterday, so winter's not done here by any means. And so thank you, Chris, for just opening up the conversation. I'll just speak for a couple minutes, maybe a little bit about how I came to this conversation, because I don't consider myself an expert on philanthropy. I've been invited to this space because I've been exploring some topics in relation to philanthropy and colonization and Indigenous nations in Canada. So just in order to really do that, in order to get to the diagnosing work that Chris kind of pointed to, I just want to spend a minute and explain how I got here, so you know. Where do I start? I guess I'll start in 2006. At that time, I moved back to my reserve to, basically start an NGO, an environmental NGO. And for a very long time, leading up to that moment, I had been working in the environmental not-for-profit sector. And I was very intent to gather the skills needed that my family and community could use to address some of the issues that we perceived as important in terms of affecting us. And I'm not going to get in too deep to what that looked like, but it is important to say this. Because it marks a shift and a turning point that's important for our conversation today. I was working on environmental issues as if they are not part of a bigger context. Those environmental issues looked like environmental racism affecting First Nations communities, specifically mine, Fort William First Nation, which is an Anishinaabe community. And we were trying to address these issues in ways that were immediate, like trying to stop illegal dumping on our community, trying to raise awareness about the environmental pollutants coming out of the industries that literally surround my community. And, we had success and whatnot, but then something very, very critical happened. I read a book called Decolonizing Methodologies by Linda Smith. I wasn't in university at the time. This is when I was 26 years old. I hadn't gone to school yet. And I was running this organization. I had started with community members. And my whole world changed when I read that book, because I realized that by working on environmental issues in the way that we were, in a way that didn't really make the connections to colonialism in the way that I later did, basically, I realized that we were never really going to get down to the root of the problem. We were only ever going to really address the symptoms of the problem, which in that case were manifesting in environmental racism and environmental issues problems that we were living with. And I tell that story because I want to kind of jump from there into this conversation about philanthropy, in the same sense that where I really believe, and this is where my work and my research comes into play, that if we do not make the connections between the work that we're doing and the kind of everyday sense and the intentions that we have in our work, whether that be in environmental issues, philanthropy, or otherwise, if it's any sense of social justice to it at all, in the Canadian context, especially when talking about Indigenous issues, we cannot do that without some sort of connection to colonization and settler colonialism. And just getting back to the environmental organization story for a moment, it was very clear to me at that moment that we were, by not getting down to the problem, we were actually a part of the problem in some ways, because we didn't have the language, and we didn't have we weren't able to deploy our energy in a way that really made those connections and called out colonialism in some way, or made it explicit in terms of how some of the progressive projects, whether ours or otherwise in our area, were really getting down to the root of the problem, as opposed to just moving on with life and trying to fix the symptoms, and not actually critically drilling down. So how does all that connect to what we're here for today? The way I come to this conversation with philanthropy and Indigenous issues is that I strongly believe, and I do research on, the connection between philanthropy and settler colonialism in Canada. As we'll talk about, no doubt, in this conversation, and I know my co-panelist and Chris as well have a ton of experience in technique to do this. But I just believe that, and I do, and what my research shows is that there are ways in which well-intentioned work can uphold the colonial structure. This was the case with residential schools. Not every person who was involved with residential schools believed that they were doing wrong. Many believed that they were doing right. Yet we saw the outcome. And so now I'm not comparing philanthropy to residential schools, but the point I'm trying to get at is that we, unless we have that consciousness, I believe that we are dangerous at times. Dangerous in the sense that we may reproduce some of these structures and asymmetrical relationships that ultimately, in the end, colonize or maintain colonialism in Indigenous communities in Canada. So that's my purpose for being here today. I don't want to take up too much more space. I know this was just an opening question. So Kristen, maybe I'll pass it back to you, but I'm more than happy to continue drilling down a bit more.
Cook's Gem. Thank you so much, Damien. It is incredibly true what you said, that without the knowing, without recognizing the structures that exist, of which we are participating in and therefore complicit in, we have the ability to act very dangerously. And so folks talk about how important it is to know history. But interestingly, my experience in what I call settler philanthropic sector in this country has a very foggy view of history. So for just a little bit of context, the Circle on Philanthropy is a national member-based organization, and our big purpose is to move settler philanthropic wealth into the hands of Indigenous peoples, into their decision-making authority, so they're able to do the good work that they want and they want to do, whatever it is that it looks like. If they're in relationship to land and community, they should have abundant resources to do that work. I use some language called that we've been using and creating space for in the sector. When I say settler created philanthropy, I'm talking about philanthropy that has been created, wealth that has been created on the backs and on the lands of Indigenous and others since the beginning of time, and that continues, right? So whether that's family generated wealth through merchants, whether that's community wealth created through resource extraction. Effectively, one of our positions is all wealth in this country is created on the lands and the backs of Indigenous peoples. And so for one of many reasons, that wealth should appropriately go back to where it belongs. So I really love the understanding about the history and knowing the structures of harm, so that when we talk about research and understanding how research has a role to play in the philanthropic context, we have to recognize that as well. Academia and research has little for harm, and knowing more makes us better. We can know more and we can do better. So one of the questions that we want to expand on is this realization that this is a tense conversation for some people. Some folks really are not interested in talking about and understanding settler colonialism and its linkage to philanthropy. Like, I'm a philanthropist. I want to do good. I want to give money. Like, what's so bad about that? But I think that our next guest, Jonas, will have a lot to share about why it's important to understand the tensions, to understand the power asymmetry. And I'm going to hand over to you, Jonas, to just expand a little bit more about what you've been hearing this morning, but also a bit more about your work and the desire you have for reforming philanthropy as well.
Thank you. I'm really glad to be here today. And I'm really excited that Chris keeps inviting me into these really cool conversations that I get to be a part of. Just to quickly respond to Damien's point on comparing philanthropy to residential schools, I'd make the argument, I can make that argument. All Canadian philanthropy is settler philanthropy. Canadian philanthropy is rooted in laws that go back to colonial times. We currently, our Canadian philanthropic sector, this sector that is designed to be doing good, legally is built on extraction, exploitation, genocide, and the same institutional funders, and Chris, I assume you have the stats on this, there are major funders that currently exist in Canada that claim to be supporting reconciliation, that claim to be supporting environmental addressing environmental racism, that if you look into their books, contributed to residential schools. So when we talk about reimagining Canadian philanthropy, I think it starts to Damien's point about recognizing that we are part of the problem. We in the charitable sector, 85,000 charities in this country, allow ourselves to be governed by these laws. We in the philanthropic sector, 10,000 foundations in this country, allow us to be governed by these laws. And the fact is that these laws perpetuate a donor-centric approach of philanthropy that prioritizes the needs of philanthropists and foundations over the needs of communities, particularly Black and Indigenous communities in this country. So there's a fundamental problem within Canadian philanthropy, and I think the tension that you see over the last 2 years, what I like to refer to as our moment of white consciousness, is the fact that a lot of people were not aware that the sector was set up this way. The fact that a lot of people are realizing the inequalities, the systemic barriers and the systemic inequalities that have existed in this country, right? And the fact that the philanthropic community of Canada, the settler philanthropic community of Canada, is the one sector in our public discourse, particularly on public policy, that we're not allowed to analyze or critique in any way, because the narrative is that people are doing good, or they're here to be doing good, when it should be, these are taxpayer assets. The second you receive a charitable benefit, you are being given the privilege of deciding when and where to allocate taxpayer money. And the reality is, and academia has a tremendous role in playing in this, the reality is Canadian philanthropy does not care about Black or Indigenous people. And it's not just me saying that, it's the fact. The Carleton report with Foundations for Black Communities, the stats that everybody is currently using to demonstrate how little of philanthropic resources go to Black charities across this country comes from a report done by academia. The land back report and the other 95 that was done by the Yellowhead
Institute.
Thank you, Yellowhead Institute. These resources exist for us. The fact that BYU University in Utah raises more money than all Indigenous groups in this country collectively get is a fundamental feeling of Canadian philanthropy. So in our moment right now that we exist, this moment of white consciousness, which is really going by really fast, and the appetite and the tolerance for these awkward conversations, I see it slipping day by day. Question for me is, how can academia push these conversations forward? It also matters who in academia is doing these research and these conversations, right? I'm not here just to have another white person talk to me about why, or to justify why our communities need resources or access to support. I want to hear from the perspectives of Black and Indigenous researchers. I want to hear them and the way that they do their research, particularly that's not harmful when they're engaged in communities that have been full of trauma. I think there's a significant role, but I know I sound very aggressive and pessimistic, but I'm extremely optimistic because I get to meet these academics. I get to meet this next generation of philanthropists that are not interested in hoarding assets or maintaining vanity through incrementalism and virtue signaling. I'm optimistic.
Yes. You know, Jonas, you don't sound angry, you sound truthful. And I think that it's so important to just position the fact that, Black and Indigenous folks, we often are told that we have to control the tone of our voice and that we're being angry. This is not anger, people. This is truth. This is just truth. And I love that opening about research and who does it and how matters. That matters so deeply. If we want to talk about, reimagining philanthropy, I think that, as Damien suggests, as Jonas suggests, we have to make space for understanding that there are other philanthropic behaviors that exist in this world. So at the Circle, a lot of the work that we're amplifying more and more is what we call Indigenous philanthropic behavior. These are the teachings, the laws, the practices that demonstrate that Indigenous people have been ethically stewarding their own resources since the beginning of time. And they have a heck of a lot of wisdom about what ethical redistribution of wealth looks like over long periods of time. So there's a really big opportunity and an invitation to the Canadian settler philanthropic sector. It's that you're not alone. You're kind of a baby in this philanthropy thing. And you've got organizations like ours, you've got researchers like Damien, you've got organizations led by folks like Jonas, and the invitation is clear. Create space and abundantly fund and support the leadership of folks who are just enacting, actually, their own laws. One of the connections Damien and I had when I met him early is I said, man, I just have been like floating around in the world, thinking about and learning more and more about Indigenous peoples and the ways in which they're enacting their laws and how they've been governing themselves and stewarding resources and distributing wealth for generations. And I have to say that I'm kind of irritated that in order to do that well in the Canadian charitable context, Indigenous communities need to be governed by the Canadian Revenue Agency, and we have to be governed by the Income Tax Act. Wait a second. Is this not a country that cares about truth and reconciliation? Is this not a country that says that they care about Indigenous people's rights? Well, the argument that we're supporting now more and more is that anytime Indigenous people connected to their land, accountable to their communities, are enacting their laws, that in fact, that's not philanthropy, that's not charitable behavior. That's a demonstration of their sovereignty. And so I think there's some really exciting potential for research and how research can enliven the notion that actually supporting Indigenous-led efforts to actualize their rights is about sovereignty. It's rights actualization, and there is some really big leadership that the CRA and the ITA could learn from those approaches. So I want to come back to you, Damien, because you've done some research in this space, and you are also aware of the data gaps, right? So we know that there's some major data gaps to actually getting the information we need to advocate more effectively on these issues. Can you share a little bit about where some of those data gaps are, or where some of the openings for Indigenous-led and other equity-seeking-led research can be really helpful in this moment?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so this intersection brings me to a couple key things that I do in my research. I mean, obviously, as I mentioned, I touch on philanthropy and Indigenous governance and decolonization. By and large, my research does focus on Indigenous governance and the resurgence of Indigenous nationhoods, according to respective Indigenous nations governing and legal orders. And so I'll just kind of tie these together a little bit. So as Chris kind of pointed to, I'll get back to the gaps in a moment. But as Chris pointed to, let's just start from the start. Indigenous nations have their own governing systems. They don't require Canada's intervention in order for their inherent governing systems to be valid. And I'll use that word inherent a few times as I speak here for the next few minutes. And by inherent, I mean those systems of governance and those legal orders that not just predate Canada, but continue to exist outside the purview of Canada's kind of assumption of sovereignty, territorial sovereignty, but also political sovereignty. And so, I'm not speaking about Indigenous governance or Indigenous law as something frozen in time. They do predate the state, that's just a fact. But these things continue to exist outside of things like the Indian Act, things like the Income Tax Act, where the gaps exist. It's about how do we work with those, like how does the philanthropic community work with those inherent governing and legal orders, so that through well-intentioned philanthropy, the colonial order isn't upheld directly or at all if we can hit that goal. But what does all that mean? So if Indigenous peoples continue to have their own political and legal orders, one of the big things that is in the way of seeing those things, and a big barrier for these nations to rebuild and re-strengthen these orders, are things like Canadian legislation. For example, the Indian Act, and I'll talk a little bit about the Income Tax Act in a moment. And so when I think about philanthropy, right, so I look at philanthropy at this intersection from the point of view of Indigenous nations continue to exist, they continue to have their legal orders, political orders, they may be bruised, or as Audra Simpson says, they may be lacerated, but that doesn't mean they're dead. It doesn't mean that they're not there. And so when we think about philanthropic activity, I think it is very worthwhile for philanthropic communities and organizations, foundations and whatnot, to know, at least at the very basis, that often the most well-resourced and the most visible governing structures in Indigenous communities are often the ones that are installed by the Canadian state. And I don't mean installed in terms of the puppet individuals. Like, I'm not saying that individuals on chiefs and councils and whatnot are bad people. I'm saying that the structure itself is imposed. The chief and council system is imposed, and it's well-resourced. And this is a colonial tactic that's been around for a very long time in Canada, to fund and support the imposed system to marginalize the inherent system. There's lots of evidence for this. Okay, so in terms of getting down to kind of, getting back to Chris's question and comments, specifically, some of my research right now looks at how the Income Tax Act and how it deals with qualified donees, I would say, is actually upholding the colonial system. And I know that, Bill S-216 is afoot, which is going to, if it passes, will address some of the qualified donee issues. But just for the sake of understanding where we are at right now, for a Indigenous person who has authority to lead according to their own inherent governance system, in my mind, I can't think of a better, act of political colonialism in the moment to say to that person, you have authority to lead and govern according to your people's way of doing things, but we need you to jump this hoop to become a qualified donee in accordance with the Canadian Income Tax Act and case law that says now you are qualified to accept funds from a philanthropic organization. Like, to me, that screams colonialism. I mean, these inherent leaders have the authority to lead already, and yet they're being asked to jump a hoop, right? And so if we think about what, in a political sense, what has colonization done in North America for so long, it's that your system is not real, it's not really governing, it's not really law. You have to become qualified, I'm just going to use that word, you have to become assimilated, right, into the Eurocentric way of doing things in order to be seen as legitimate, right? That's the Indian Act, that's what it does. But we see this a little bit happening in the philanthropic sector through this qualified donee status. And so the question then becomes, what to do with that? Like, there are First Nations and there are Indigenous organizations that are becoming qualified donees. And I don't fault them for that. Like, that's a pragmatic way of doing something. It's a pragmatic way of accessing some of that philanthropic wealth. There's also, organizations and foundations out there that are finding ways around that through shared platforms and whatnot, so that individuals, indigenous groups and whatnot can access some of that wealth without having to jump that hoop. Though these things are I think incremental steps, and I think that they're good. But if we're taking a broad diagnostic view of what colonization looks like in the philanthropic sector, we have to understand that these systemic barriers and systemic structures, are not just simply about accountability and not just simply about managing wealth in a way that protects, public integrity. They are also not disconnected. They're not disconnected from the colonial structure. And if you look closely enough, you can see that structure moving, and you can see how the threads are interwoven together. And this is one of those spaces. And so when we get down to talking about gaps and whatnot, the big gap, I think, I've had philanthropic organizations and EDs of charitable and not-for-profit organizations say to me that, okay, we hear what you're saying. We know we can buy the fact that Indigenous nations have multiple governing systems happening at the same time in the same place, but how do we work with those inherent systems? How do we know, right? And I mean, the answer to that is, it's a little bit messy, but the answer to that is I think ultimately fairly straightforward. If philanthropic foundations make the space for those inherent leaders to come forward, that's pretty much all they need to do, I would think. The communities and the nations themselves will be able to go through the process to identify, or whatever, somebody who, from that inherent governing system, who can come forward and say, like, I'm going to, be the figurehead for a project or whatever the case may be. The wrong approach would be to say, like, okay, now me, philanthropic organization, is going to go and identify the person. That's not going to work. But it's messy, because this is ultimately work that Indigenous communities themselves need to sort out internally. But that is much more productive than what some other EDs have said to me in the past. They say, well, the chief and council system, for example, in a First Nation context, the chief and council system is the legitimate version of governance, according to the law, and so we're just going to work with them because it's easier for us. Yeah, that's a failure of leadership, in my opinion. Like, philanthropic organizations that are conscious of social justice and maybe interested in decolonization have to do more than that. I think that they really do need to make the space for inherent leaders and to support those leaders if and when they come forward. I think that's the job. The last thing I'll say, just to your question, Chris, in your commentary, is that we're in this moment of reconciliation. And unfortunately, I think that has become a little bit too all-encompassing, where, now everything needs to be reconciled, and say, every aspect of our work together, say if it's Indigenous and community and a non-Indigenous organization, or even a broader level, societal level, that now everything Indigenous needs to be reconciled. I don't think that that's the case. In fact, I think that's really problematic. I think it's the spaces where Indigenous nationhoods, governing systems, and legal orders are not reconciled because they're what's the right word? They are incommensurate, or they don't fit into the relationship as a puzzle piece. Those things need to be left as is, because there's as we heard in the opening, there are two canoes, and this imagery that comes along to row wampum. There are places where there may be common ground to talk about certain things, but there are also places where there isn't common ground, and to force those puzzle pieces together, right, and when they don't really fit, I think is really problematic. So I would invite, as we think through these broader conversations about decolonization and working with inherent leaders and whatever the case may be, I would also invite, this idea of remaining unreconciled in places where communities say, like, that's for us, right? Like we don't have to, like for example, we don't have to jump the hoop to become a qualified donee. We're going to remain unreconciled. And in that unreconciliation, there remains sovereignty, right? There remains that inherent authority to act. It does not everything has to be reconciled. Not everything has to be made great and hold hands and sing kumbaya. There are spaces of where Indigenous nations don't need to be connected to the Canadian state or Canadian society in that way. That's a really big concept, and obviously could be, narrowed down significantly in terms of like work and whatnot. But I'll just leave it there and plant that seed and stop talking.
Thank you, Damien. I think that's a really beautiful reminder. At our organization, we don't talk about reconciliation. It's like reconciliation is like rhetorical noise-making stuff that's been co-opted. But we talk about reciprocity because then we can acknowledge the asymmetry in power. But we can be honest about it, and we can make choices about where there's transaction and where there's transformation and who's leading and who isn't. I think that's a really beautiful notion that I don't need the folks in Settler Philanthropy to understand my teachings. I need them to know that I know it and to support me to enact it and get out of the way. I think that there's this notion of constant curiosity, and this is the connection to research, the like constant curiosity. I must know, I must understand, I must, grapple at the depths of what it is that you're talking about, like these Indigenous methodologies and these ways of thinking, or understand the ways other equity-seeking peoples are enacting their philanthropic behavior. But I do think there's a bigger invitation, which is to say, you can't possibly understand it, and that's okay. I think that's something settlers need to know. You can't understand it. You're not born from the hills of my Secwepemc territory. Your ancestors haven't walked that land and learned from the land about how to be in relation to the kin of the land and of the people. It's okay that you don't understand, but I just need you to recognize that your lack of understanding doesn't mean that you can't help. In fact, you're a better helper if you just acknowledge that you'll never understand, but you can help anyways, and help those who actually have the leadership and the vision for what's possible. Connected to this, I think that folks who are here, who care about research, here's something to pay attention to. What is the data that the T3010 gathers, and what doesn't it gather? And who is served by what we gather, and who is harmed by what we don't gather? Those are some questions that I think there's folks here who can really dig into. One of the pieces we're really passionate about as well is understanding that, when Indigenous organizations have made a decision that because they want more access to philanthropic dollars, that they're willing to go through the charitable status machine to get that qualification, whether it's non-qualified donee or to become a registered charitable organization, they have to turn to the CRA for that check mark. Well, the CRA certainly can't understand the nuance of Indigenous organizations and the needs that are being served by various groups. But there's this very peculiar thing that happens, which is for folks who are advocating to have their human rights actualized, when they're advocating for things like clean drinking water and ongoing access to their territories, when they're protecting their land, they're never going to get a CRA number from the government for that, because they're actively working against what it is that the federal government wants to do and thinks is the best thing to do. So what happens is you have a whole range of organizations who are impeded from their ability to do good work that serves not only their communities, but Canadians at large. They are prohibited from gaining access to philanthropic dollars, which was created on their lands and on their backs and continues to perpetuate harm, because they are too political. They're too loud. They're advocating. A prime example, you all know the Orange Shirt Day. How many of you were wearing orange shirts over the last couple of years for a variety of things? The Orange Shirt Day organization was denied charitable status. Can you believe that? we cannot deny that the work that they're doing is incredibly essential and important, not only for Canadians, but for the healing and well-being of Indigenous peoples, but denied charitable status because their work was not deemed relevant in the charitable context. So this is an organization, for example, that we advocate loudly for to receive non-receivable funds. They should be able to have access to the funds and do their good work. That's a whole nother conversation about how the CRA can learn to think and do differently in relation to Indigenous communities. But there are other communities, other equity-seeking communities who are harmed by these processes of so-called accountability. We know that Muslim organizations also experience undue audits from the CRA for their organizations. As Jonas said, Black-led organizations receive less than $1 of community foundation dollars in this country. The other piece is like the Circle back in 2014 did a data scrape, and that was the first piece of research that looked at how many philanthropic dollars go to Indigenous organizations. And they were like, holy moly, it's 1%. Did it again in 2017. This time they had Indigenous people around the table a little bit more. And they were like, well, wait a second, that 1%, that doesn't actually talk about Indigenous-led organizations. And if we look at the 1% of folks who are getting dollars, they're mostly not Indigenous-led organizations. They're the big groups who serve, they benefit, they have beneficiaries that are Indigenous. So, after the 2017 data, I just thought, why would I waste my time and the time of our organization to go and find out what we already know? We're going to be working on accountabilities with the settler-created philanthropic sector so that the administrative burden of changing and advocating for laws, for adding unique markers to the T3010 to understand the demographics of organizations who are doing this work and who they actually serve is important, right? We need that data to do our best work. I'm not wasting my time and money and to advocate to pull data that is useless to me. What I will advocate for is that those of you who are here learn about the structural inequities that prohibit organizations like ours, like Jonas and others, from gathering the information we need to build the case for the good work that's happening. So I want to turn to you, Jonas, to talk about your vision for reforming philanthropy. So this is about imagination. The big, wide imagination is like Indigenous and other equity-seeking organizations are abundantly funded, that there's a research community that has rigor to kind of impact and think critically about the colonial structures at play. But I love that your organization jumped up and said, we've got some ideas about reform, and you're not playing around. So fill us in. Tell us a little bit about some of those concepts for philanthropic reform.
Yeah, I think it comes down to a lot of the things that we were saying, both yourself and Damien right now. What is the role of Canadian philanthropy, right? For us, the crust of it sort of is Canadian philanthropy is supposed to fill the gaps that government has, to fund innovation, to take risk. I would argue we have not seen that. Not only because there's this weird cultural approach that we have in Canada towards philanthropy, and at the same time from the government, I think there's a tremendous amount of fear about philanthropy because it is a tremendous power imbalance. Those at the very top are often very well connected to government, if not to government, to other players that have a significant amount of control in this country. So to us, it's you have 6 million Canadians that are food insecure, right? You have City of Toronto violence increasing over 179% over the last 3 years. You have an urban affordability crisis. You have all these perpetuating crises that exist. What is the role of philanthropy in addressing those? We feel that they haven't met their purpose. As such, we're calling for the federal government of Canada because we don't believe the philanthropic sector's collective ability to self-regulate or reform. Calling on the government of Canada to ensure that people have the ability to not only live in dignity, but to thrive. So our 6 pillars of philanthropic reform include, yes, making changes to non-qualified donees. I'm not too happy with what's written in the budget because it presents more questions than answers. We are also calling for all foundation assets. These are taxpayer assets designed for a charitable purpose, majority of which is invested in the stock market. Make that make sense. These assets should be 100% impact invested. And I know we don't have an adequate definition of impact investing, but it should be towards the betterment of Canadians. We're also calling for these assets that the Income Tax Act of Canada allows to exist in perpetuity, to exist forever, which makes no sense. To get rid of that system. That if you have a foundation that has hundreds of millions of dollars in it, that you, within a reasonable timeline, we're calling that reasonable timeline 30 years, you spend these assets. We can no longer wait. It's very funny for me to hear environmental funders justify their work when they recognize there's less than 10 years before we hit our threshold, and yet you're maintaining these assets for ensuring it to be sustainable for the future generations. It can make sense, right? We're also calling for the federal government of Canada, because it's demonstrated it has a tremendous convening power when it wants to ensure that philanthropic resources that go to Black and Indigenous-led organizations, particularly funders, it's matched by the federal government of Canada. Did you guys know if you have an endowment at an art-based organization, particularly one of the bigger art ones, and a donor donates $1 million to you, the federal government can match that into that endowment? And yet we're jumping around justifying our community's needs. So the government, and particularly those last few years, have demonstrated a tremendous ability. When they want to get things done, they can get it done. You look at a pandemic, the amount of money that we've spent during this pandemic, I would argue some of it not effective or efficient. That's a whole other conversation. The money was there when we wanted it to be. Mm-hmm. You have the war in Ukraine. When we need money to be available, it's available. The fact that the United Nations and appeal for the Ukraine was filled within a week, just by governments around this world, tells us the role that government can play, but we purposely choose not to. And on advocacy, we've had 2 years of a lot of different equity-seeking groups mobilizing the federal government around variety of these issues. But why is it that Black and Indigenous groups have to justify support to their communities at a greater level than other equity-seeking groups? Why is it that I have to justify Islamophobia versus anti-Semitism? Why is it that I have to justify, protecting young Muslim girls' ability to wear hijabs at their own convenience versus LGBTQ rights? Like, why is one equity-seek group more valued by the federal government of Canada than others? When we demonstrate, we are able to, when academia, to be honest, when government has academia justifying these issues, we're able to act towards it really quickly. So is there a lack of urgency from government? Yes, but there's also a lack of urgency from philanthropy, from academia as well. We should be working towards an end goal in philanthropy. If I'm here 10 years from now talking about anti-violence to you, I fundamentally failed. If I'm here 10 years from now talking about reforming philanthropy, I failed. We should be collectively moving with that mindset. I'm here to work myself out of a job, not being here maintaining power imbalances within philanthropy or contributing to the stupidity of philanthropy.
Thank you. Yes. I think this reminds me about one of the questions. So the very lovely Jean-Marc and Peter provided a few questions for us to chomp on. One of the questions was, is it appropriate that philanthropic resources be dispersed at the sole discretion of the founders of a grant-making organization? And Jonas and Damien and I were all like, no. The answer is just no. No, it should not be at the discretion of the people who are the sole founders of that wealth. And so I thought I would just at least share that question. You have an unequivocal, the answer is no. We could expand on that. But I hope what you're hearing is that it becomes essential to move the decision-making authority for real amounts of money and ensure that it is in the hands of equity-seeking communities. That Black-led, Indigenous-led, that queer-led organizations are leading the charge for how they see change happening We don't need folks who created the wealth to be the only decision makers on it. Jonas? I saw, were you just like, yeah, or were you like, oh my
Right,
gosh,
no,
I have to say
I have to say something because I'm in agreement. Like, if the answer is no, but again, this is taxpayer money.
yes.
This is the public's money. 120 billion of it. It should not be. You founders or funders or donors or whatever have been given this privilege of deciding when and where to allocate this money, and they've shown a complete failing on that front.
Yes.
There should be no public foundations in Canada, period. This is all a very Western institutionalized form of philanthropy that's fundamentally failing. Right?
Yeah.
Sorry, before
You know,
you
it's
stop
like,
there, Dave.
it's I remember, you know, working at a community foundation and realizing that you know, the disbursement quota was 3.5%, and I was like, wait, what? So then, like, what happens with the rest of the money? Oh, it's invested. And it was just this turning point of like, well, wait a second. The philanthropic sector in this country has more money sitting in investments than goes out the door to serve communities. How is that right? You can't call that philanthropy. You can call that investment with a side of giving, right? And like, not only like giving, but like, we're just going to give you some pennies. We're going to let you find the change in the couch and play with that. Go play with that. We're over here investing. So yeah, I think that there's lots to talk about here. I want to come back to this piece around reimagining philanthropy, and then we're going to make space for questions. I haven't been looking at the chat, but I hope that folks are being really curious and asking questions, etc. So in closing, one of the things we wanted to share from each of us was a response to this question of what are some of the questions or the characteristics of the people or the organizations or institutions that we want alongside us as we reimagine a future. Over to you, Damien.
Yeah. I remember when we spoke about this earlier that Jonas had a way better answer than me. um,
You want
so
to throw to Jonas?
no, I'll share what I have, and then I think it was actually we did the way it rolled out last time we spoke was actually great because it really tied up nicely. The thing that it's not so much a principle, it's more about a consciousness for me. It's just coming back to that point of enforcing, but raising the consciousness within the philanthropic community that there are more than one governing systems at play within many Indigenous communities, right? Sometimes it's very clear that there is the recognized governing system, such as, for example, a chief and council, and at the same time a traditional or inherent governing body. Sometimes it's very clear, and sometimes it's not very clear. But I think that not very clear is not the fault of the Indigenous community. Like it's a symptom of colonialism. And when I say, so my answer to the point about, well, what's the principles and things that that we're looking for in leaders, it's that consciousness to be having that open mind to move through these conversations that can be uncomfortable, not only because of the way that being critical of philanthropy shines light back onto the way settler colonialism may manifest in your own organization, but also uncomfortable in the sense that you're not going to know sometimes who these inherent leaders are. But that's no excuse, I guess, to say it like that. Like that's no excuse to not make the space for those inherent leaders, because I've seen it too many times where the solution to this call that I'm making is just to say, well, we'll work with those that we can see. And that's not always the most decolonial thing that can be done. So I'll just leave it there.
Thank you. Jonas, I remembered this conversation too, and you kicked us off with, we need accomplices, not allies. What are your thoughts about the characteristics of the folks we need?
Well, I think over the last few years, particularly right after the death of George Floyd, saw a lot of statements of support, statements of concern, black boxes, pledges, declarations, all these promises and all these concerns. And to me, they were all wrapped around this concept of allyship. And allyship is a clear and fundamental failing. And our communities need accomplices, people who are willing to put up their sleeves, get their arms dirty, and put not only their name, their reputation, but their financial resources on the line to ensure that Canadians have the ability to thrive. And that means moving to systems or movements of solidarity, right? I'm not interested in charity. I want justice. I want economic mobilization for our communities. I want to move forward, right? I don't want to be in this continuous cycle of stupidity. And this mirage of meaningless opportunities that we've seen over the last 2 years does not serve us, right? It does not strengthen Indigenous sovereignty. It does not. It's not curious enough. It's not ambitious enough. It's not bold, right? And so I want accomplices that are willing to make bold commitments, bold visions, right? Not for communities, but with communities, right? And I'm optimistic that we have a new generation of philanthropists coming in here, particularly younger ones, particularly those that are not under this institutionalized form of philanthropy. I'm optimistic, right? Hopefully their curiosity stays for a little bit longer, and then we can actually do some really interesting stuff.
Amazing. Thank you. Yes, and definitely the curiosity is a character trait. Some might call it a flaw of the circle. As we often say, we have more questions than we have answers. And in the reconciliation space in this country, everyone wants answers. They want a checkbox. They want it neat and tidy. They want it done. They don't want it to be messy. And they want to feel better at the end of it all. And my invitation to find folks who want to work alongside us is to say, we need you to be curious. We need you to stay in the muck and the mire. We need folks who can recognize how colonial structures are causing themselves and others harm and be willing to move out of it. I think the other piece is ultimately we need more and more organizations, accomplices, institutions who can make space for the voices of those who are systemically marginalized in this country, and then to heed their wisdom and advice. I don't want to do any more focus groups. I don't want to give any more ideas. I don't want to do any more brainstorming. I've got wisdom. Our organizations have wisdom. The organizations on the ground, the movements that are building have deep, deep wisdom about what's needed in this country. And we need researchers, we need philanthropic educators, we need donors who will heed that advice and get out of the way and make space for this leadership. So with that, we hope that this has been an interesting conversation. And I believe I hand over to Jean-Marc and Peter to field us with more questions or, to see what folks had to say in the chat. Thank you so much. Ooh, just to pause. I don't know if you can still hear me, but I can't hear Jean-Marc, which might make it difficult if you're asking questions.
No, can you hear me?
Okay, so I think I can hear you and you can hear me. Good.
Yes.
Great. Thanks. Okay, so thank you very much for the animation. I might have a question for you. I think you rightly show that it was very important to have a decolonial stand, and I agree with this. But it's a kind of a position that we need to have, but I'm not sure what is a non-colonial stand, because we are so much embedded in colonial way of thinking that it's very difficult to understand the new kind of pattern, values, and so on. So maybe I don't know if Eunice or Damien, you can illustrate ways to be non-colonial in doing a living together.
I want to hop in on this. first, and then I'll throw over to Damien and Jonas. One of the things that we do, I mean, so right now the Circle is hosting 65 leaders from the philanthropic sector in this country in a conversation in our year-long peer learning journey for settler philanthropy about the characteristics of white supremacy that they are upholding in their organizations. And we invite them to identify the pivots for how they will move away from them. One of the things we hear most often is folks go, well, I wouldn't know what's different. And it's like, well, if you're ever doing a thing and you're doing it the way it's supposed to be done, or you're doing it in the way that feels normal or natural, that's when you need to interrogate. You need to ask yourself, who told me that this is how it's supposed to be? And are there actual other systems of wisdom that could help me come away from what is the status quo or the norm? Especially if you were a white person working in the space or working in academia. If you're doing what feels normal for you, almost always it's going to be colonial. Damien and Jonas?
I was just going to say what you said, but also to add on to that, I think there's a concept right now floating around philanthropy called trust-based philanthropy. But for me, trust-based philanthropy is the bare minimum of the work. So that means, giving unrestricted grants. That means not making organizations do ridiculous application processes or reporting processes. That means you as a funder going beyond a check and utilizing your network, your resources, and your social capital to support and protect those grantees or organizations that you support. And that's the bare minimum. Also, to plug in our organization, if you're a funder, implement 6 pillars of philanthropic reform. Stop with all the talk. Get to it. Talk is cheap. Our lives matter.
Thanks for that. Yeah, a quick response. There's a lot of models, contemporary and historic, that we can look to. We heard earlier about the two-row wampum. There's that plays here. It plays here in terms of what does decolonial space look like? I'm going to assume in this answer that most Canadians are going to want to keep Canada. And if that's the case, we have to understand that Canada was always set up to be a colonial outpost. I mean, I'm not trying to be pessimistic or cynical here. It's the fact of the history of the state. It's a capitalist state. There's a lot of things that make it, I would say, potentially impossible to decolonize Canada in its current form. So assuming that that's going to stick around, then we can look to things like the two-row wampum. Oh, yeah, do you have a question? No? Okay, so we can assume that it's going to stick around. And there's going to be a social justice push within that state, and etc. But if we're assuming that, we can look to things like the two-row wampum, and we can apply that in ways that I would say respect spaces of irreconcilability. There's a really brilliant Métis artist scholar in Saskatchewan named David Garneau, who has written about spaces of Aboriginal or Indigenous irreconcilability. And what he says is that the relationship between settler Canadians and Indigenous nations can be mediated between a space that's a shared territory. This can be a treaty, it can be some sort of other territorial or political space. And in that space, the true, the kind of like inherent authentic, that's a really risky word, but like in the way that, the true power of Indigenous sovereignty is not given away, but it's kind of like made more intelligible to the settler state. But in that space of shared recognition, that is buffering the space of the unreconciled space of Indigenous territorial sovereignty, political sovereignty. And so to your the way I would answer your question, Jean-Marc, is that I don't think it's going to be across the board, and if we're assuming that the Canadian state is going to persist. What I'm saying, though, is that to reach that decoloniality, I think that is to respect that space and to support that space without intervening in it, just like the two-row, And just like what Garneau speaks about of the space of irreconcilable Aboriginality. And that's what I think about too when I mentioned earlier about philanthropic organizations supporting inherent leaders without this Canadian state requiring them to become qualified donees. That's exactly the same thing. It's just a different way of saying it.
So I do have two more questions coming from the audience. One from Floriane Lemoine. So she said, thank you so much for this conversation. My main frustration in the philanthropic area is seeing that the decision makers are never around these discussion tables. I'm pretty sure they don't read research paper either, unfortunately. How to reach them? So what kind of action should we do to be able to have strong discussion with the leaders of different institutions, very important institutions, to make the change? So that's the question from Florian.
Jonas, you had your hand first. You go, then I'll go.
I was going to vent a little. That's a great question. Over the last year, there's been this conversation on the disbursement quota here in Canada, whether or not to raise it. So that minimum amount that foundations have to pay out to charities is 3.5%, as Chris said. It got moved to 5%. We were advocating for 10%. In that last year, a lot of, we engaged a lot of key stakeholders, put a lot of money into lobbying. We did a lot of work. And yet, the federal government of Canada prioritizes the voices of the same people that were calling for not an increase to happen were the same folks that got their literal language put into the budget. So I'm not sure, to be frank and honest. I think those that have power do not give a shit about the voices or opinions of grassroots organizations that are Black or Indigenous groups in this country, unless it's backed by those that they think it's credible, voices that they think it's credible. And the reality is these so-called credible voices are so intermingled within government, society, and culture that if you're Black or Indigenous, you have such a social capital mountain to climb that it becomes an ineffective waste of time. Those same individuals that get prioritized I guarantee you, are not the same ones that get death threats or insults the same that we do, the same way that we do. So I'm not sure. I think we need our own people in these spaces. And just to lightly tap onto Damien's point, I think we need a revisioning of Canada. I think we might need a constitutional crisis, and I'll work on it after we reform philanthropy. But we really need to think about. I think we need a new constitution. I think we need to reimagine this country, and I think philanthropy, particularly those that claim to be democratic funders, can play a transformative role in that space. That's neither here nor there.
Having a new constitution, that's something that we try in Quebec to have. Very difficult.
I think, one of the things that I would add, Florian, thank you for your question. It's lovely to know that you're here, that you're out there listening. What comes to my mind, and this is again in the work we do with settler philanthropic organizations, is we invite them first to recognize how they themselves have influence. What we see all the time in the sector is that folks who work in settler philanthropy, they deny, refute, or pretend that their power and influence doesn't exist. From the program manager who says, I'm just here to help you fill out the application, to the grant adjudicator that says, I'm just one voice around a table of decision makers around a grant decision, to board members who say, oh, I'm just here to set the vision. The operationalizing happens by the CEO. And for the CEOs who say, I'm here for the sustainability of the philanthropic institution. What happens is when everyone is deferring their power and they're denying it, it means that we tend to believe that it's the person at the top of the triangle who has the power. And the moment that I believe that there's only one person who has the power to make a difference in this policy and practice space, it means that I'm no longer engaged. So I would suggest that rather than trying to figure out how to get these reports in front of your CEO or to board members, think about where you have power and influence inside of your institutions. You might not be able to change the practice or policy, but I bet you can ask a question. And I bet you can keep asking questions. And I bet you can keep making invitations for other people to show up and to ask questions. So for us, we see question asking as an aspirational, relational building activity. I want to get to know you. I'm going to ask some questions and we're going to see where this goes. And I'm going to ask more and more questions. And I'm not interested in asking questions I've got the answers to. I'm interested in whether or not you have the capacity to create something new. I'm interested in whether or not you have the desire and the courage to step out on a ledge, to ask the questions that need to be asked, to make sure that folks who have different levels of power over practice and policy are wielding it well. There's this sense of folks in the philanthropic sector of being like, we're here for the good of people, and that somehow minimizes the power asymmetry. It doesn't. So don't try and pretend like I can be a funder and be like a good old pal and my grantees tell me the truth about everything. That's BS. So you have to be really willing to acknowledge that the power asymmetry exists and name it and work within it. But it doesn't happen if everyone is pushing against someone over there has the power to do this, right? So how am I complicit in upholding this harm? How can I pivot towards something else? And how am I going to use my power and influence to support change in others?
So there's another questions coming from the audience by Maricela Arce. I'm sorry if I didn't pronounce it well. She's asking a question about how to do research that will be working with, for example, indigenous people or marginalized people, to be able to hear the voice from those people. The way that the research is done now, it's mainly create to hear certain kind of voices and not have the contribution of others. So do you have good example of research that can be able to mobilize different kind of voices and have the participation of those voices in the production of data, but also in the analysis and the finding of solutions?
I'll speak to this and then I'll turn it over. It's a methodology question. It's also an ethics question as researchers. So methodology-wise, how do you reach those folks? And how do you make sure that those voices are centralized in the work? There's a lot of Indigenous research methodologies that are based in Indigenous thought. And the first thing, I'm just gonna have to cover this ground a little bit, but not assuming anything here. The first thing that needs to be recognized by researchers is that all Indigenous nations have different knowledge systems. So you can't apply, say, Mohawk research methodology to Haida community issues. That doesn't work. And so, to use those knowledge, to work with communities that have the authority to use that knowledge system and that research system in a way that makes sure that the voices of those who carry the responsibility for the kind of knowledge you're talking about are heard. And that last bit is very important because under the kind of municipal style governance system, under the Indian Act for First Nations, for example, people that are voted in are expected to be experts on everything. That's not how a lot of Indigenous knowledge systems work. A lot of Indigenous knowledge systems say, if you know everything there is to know about moose hunting, then you carry the responsibility to, share that knowledge in the right way, as opposed to going to the chief just because he or she was elected in. So I would say that, look to the epistemologies, look to the research methodologies that communities already have. And if you're not Indigenous and you're not from the community, then you have a hell of a lot of work to do to build the genuine relationships. That's really the only way for researchers to do this. So the methodology is there. There's work out there to look at. It's also an ethics question though. And I say that because when we look at the way that research ethics is governed in Canadian post-secondary institutions, we are, as researchers, we are pushed towards following the Tri-Council Policy Statement 2, which, Chapter 9 tends to look at, by and large, I would say de facto, tends to kind of seat all the power with Indian Act installed governing systems in First Nations. So Métis communities and Inuit communities will be a little bit different. So I'm just focusing on First Nations here. But Chapter 9 of the TCPS2, sorry to get too technical here for folks who don't live in this world, it does push you towards the kind of like recognized governing bodies in a First Nation context. But there are ways to address that, to make sure that the research that you're doing with Indigenous communities or First Nations communities tend to honor and respect and work with, in partnership, those inherent leaders alongside of the installed governing system, or in spite of, in replacement of that system. I don't want to get too much deeper into that here because I don't want to take up too much room here, but to methodology and the ethics, there is a lot of thinking that has to go into, in the current structure of how these things are run, to make sure that the voices that you're speaking about do in fact lead the conversation in the final products of research, and during, of course, as well.
Thanks, Damien. Yonis?
Just get out of the way. Got money, fund the researchers, and get out of the way. Like, why are we?
Well, that's not so simple.
I know, but it could be.
I definitely have a thinking here as well around, there is, I'll tell you a little story about the relationship of the circle with PhiLabs, which was when we first became associated with PhiLabs. The research community at PhiLabs thought that we would be their go-to to help them find a land and territorial acknowledgement. They wanted us to help them figure out how to spell the names appropriately of the territory so they could have a nice little, thing on their reports. There was a lot of expectation that we would be the kind of Indigenous Google for research. It took us a couple of years of lots of tough conversations. There were a lot of mistakes about how to be in relationship. And now I think we have at PhiLabs a community of folks who now see that our role is not about researching the relationship of money from settlers to Native folks. It's actually that we have our own research questions, our own methodologies, our own practices, values, and worldviews that demonstrate our redistribution of wealth and ethical stewardship of resources. But this question of how do we get folks involved, really, I think one of the first things you need to ask is this a piece of research about them? Or is this a piece of research alongside them? And have they helped develop the questions? Is this a question that's relevant and worthy to their outcomes and desires for liberation and justice in their own communities? Because if you don't know the answer to that, you need to go back and ask the question again. Is this about them, or is it alongside them, and who's leading? And if you can't find Indigenous people to lead or be involved in a project, I hate to say it, but probably that's because they don't find it relevant. So don't just keep looking around till you find someone who says yes. Accept and acknowledge that perhaps the question, the methodology, or the approach that you're taking is actually not relevant or useful or considered helpful. Maybe now is not the time. Instead, pay attention to the questions Indigenous organizations and people are asking, and find ways to amplify and support that work led by them.
Great. Thanks a lot for those very interesting answers. So I don't have any more questions from the audience. I don't know if, Peter, you have on your side some questions to develop, or...
Yeah, can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Okay, good, thank you. No, I've been monitoring the chat room and there aren't anything, but I think I do have, as a white settler that's kind of negotiated this space, I think it's really easy to think about, contextualize these kind of questions within the organization and the power structures within the organization, as opposed to yourself. And where does it start? And what do I see? What do I carry with me as I walk around? And a lot of this question can only be done by some very serious, meaningful, I think, and consistent, real introspection about what are my values? Where do they come from? Why do I have them? And I think that part of self-recognition can be a step toward seeing yourself in a particular context. But I'd also like to go back, I think, to a comment. I think it was Damien right at the very beginning about, and I made a note here. I think I got it right about sort of conscious intentionality, and the idea of it can be unconscious intentionality. And I think the idea of being well-meaning, but also really, and that sort of drawing in again of that aspect of self-consciousness and the importance of that. So I think that aspect of this journey, I just, people may not know this, I got a journey. When I started this, one of the first things that I was adamant about was that I didn't want I didn't want to be asking questions of Indigenous people about what to do, because that wasn't their business to educate me. It was my business to get educated, So I took the time and the resources to invest in a 2-year Indigenous nationhood graduate program at the University of Victoria, and through that investment, I've started to take some, steps in the right direction as far as this aspect is concerned, and the kind of decolonizing space, creating safe spaces, because colonization is so pervasive. You don't have to look very far. You probably don't. Colonization is within your desk. It's maybe 2 inches beyond or 2 millimeters beyond your desk. You don't have to go very far to look. And so I'm presenting that because the tendency is to want to try to do something. And I think the question we always have to ask ourselves is, am I even ready to be in relationship? Do I know what relationship looks like, whether it's a Black community or an Indigenous community? Do I even know what that looks like? And if you don't know, you need to say, okay, how do I find out? And it gets back to Chris's earlier question about the questions. So any sort of comments or reflections on that? Jonas, you're nodding a bit, but...
Well, I was getting really nerdy in my head and thinking about the actual definition of philanthropy, the Greek word, which is like love of humanity, right? And if you're intentional in your belief that you want to see the betterment of our society and the people that live within our society, I think you're pure in your intentions. It's the way you act upon those intentions that that people often stumble upon. Chris, Damien, want to add any thoughts?
Sure. I mean, I run across this all the time in teaching. Like I teach young adults at the university about colonialism and white supremacy and patriarchy and whatnot, and heteropatriarchy. Like there are people have to go through struggles sorry, I should reframe this. I don't mean to have to. What I'm saying is, like, learning about these things does require personal struggle, in the sense that you have to be able to learn, you have to have bravery, I would say, to look at yourself as, enmeshed in these bigger systems of power. I think what Peter's getting at is to like reflect upon oneself, in your case, Peter, as a white male, right? And the power that comes with that, the unearned power that comes with that in this society, right? It requires one to be honest about that and not to say something kind of like what Chris was saying earlier about like, oh, like passing the buck off to somebody else in the sense of like, I didn't put people in residential schools, therefore I don't have the responsibility to kind of address that now, right? And on down the line, like so like becoming conscious of oneself as straight male, or whatever the case may be, and moving places where, as you're saying, where you're saying about the definition of philanthropy, and the kind of like the nature, the spirit of helping one's fellow humanity, to walk into that without realizing that we are in a space that gives certain people unearned power and unearned privilege, really does allow us to bring that baggage in, that the asymmetrical power imbalance baggage that in the end can really do the damage, right? Like that's I think that's what makes it so easy. And what I tell my students is that you don't really need to be like a jerk or an asshole to uphold colonization. All you need to do is to feel comfortable and to be willing to protect that comfort, and then you're harnessed, right? Colonialism's got you, right? You're harnessed in service of that system.
Voilà, donc nous arrivons tranquillement à la fin de cette première session. Nous avons pensé la session à la fois dans des éléments d'ouverture, dans la cérémonie de reconnaissance de la Terre, après dans un panel qui a ouvert une discussion fort intéressante sur les tensions, et on voulait aussi introduire une dimension artistique à la session. C'est pourquoi nous avons demandé à Isaac Murdoch de produire une œuvre qui va être présentée sous la forme d'une vidéo et qui va nous amener dans une autre dimension, cette fois-ci plus artistique. La réflexion passe donc aussi par les arts, pas seulement par des mots. Alors, je vais rapidement introduire Isaac Murdoch. Il est de la Première Nation Nimki Ahibikong, je ne suis pas sûr de bien prononcer. Il fait partie du clan Fish et est Ojibwe. Il vit actuellement dans la forêt Ninki Ahibikong, une communauté indigène qui se concentre sur la langue indigène, l'art et les activités terrestres. Il a grandi dans le cadre traditionnel de la chasse, de la pêche et du piégeage. Il a passé plusieurs de ses années à apprendre des aînés dans les régions du nord de l'Alberta, de la Saskatchewan et du Manitoba. Isaac est très respecté en tant que conteur et détenteur du savoir traditionnel. Pendant de nombreuses années, il a dirigé divers ateliers et camps culturels axés sur le transfert des connaissances aux jeunes. Parmi ses autres domaines d'expertise, mentionnant la peinture ojibwe traditionnelle, l'imagerie et le symbolisme, la récolte, les promenades médicales, les connaissances cérémonielles, les camps culturels, l'histoire orale anishinabeg, la fabrication des canaux d'écorce, les parchemins d'écorce, les ateliers pour les jeunes et les aînés, ainsi de suite. Il a consacré sa vie à la préservation des pratiques culturelles anishinabé et a passé des années à apprendre directement de ses aînés. Donc là, je vous invite maintenant à voir la vidéo. Merci.
Rise for the babies and rise for the water and rise for our lands and rise for our daughters. Rise for the bees and rise for the flowers and rise in the east and rise up and take your power. Rise for the voiceless and rise against bombs and rise for the hungry and rise up and sing your song. Rise for the forest and rise for the trees and rise for the birds. We are free. Rise for the child pulled from their mother and rise against cages and rise for one another.
Merci beaucoup donc pour cette attention artistique. En terminant, j'aimerais donc remercier beaucoup les membres du panel, Chris, Eunice, Damien, et aussi évidemment les personnes qui ont fait la cérémonie, donc Marlène, Louis et Annick aussi pour la co-organisation. Évidemment, c'est la première session. Demain, nous allons avoir la deuxième session qui va commencer à midi. Il ne faut pas oublier qu'on est sur des fuseaux horaires différents. Donc, c'est midi, heure de l'Est, heure normale de l'Est, ça va varier évidemment si vous êtes situé en Colombie-Britannique ou dans l'Atlantique. Donc, demain, 2 sessions, une première à midi et une deuxième à 2h40. Alors, écoutez, merci beaucoup. Ça a été une session très remplie, très riche. Et on va se retrouver donc pour la suite de cette conférence. Merci pour votre participation. À la prochaine.